Welcome from the studios of KPBS TV in San Diego, California. We are reaching you live through a unique and complex international telecommunications network via satellite, microwave, and cable. The International Training Center at San Diego State University brings us all together in this video conference, which joins distinguished organizations located in Mexico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, Spain, the United States of America, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, in Geneva, Switzerland. Welcome to our program, Organizational Ethics and Responsibility, Optimizing Performance in the Third Millennium. This is the 8th video conference in the series Foundations for Prosperity in the Third Millennium. My name is Richard Page, and I will be your moderator for today's program. I'm a private attorney in San Diego with the Page firm, practicing in the areas of business and international litigation, including arbitration and mediation. Today's program is composed of 2 presentation modules and 2 question and answer sessions. We look forward to your live participation. Sustained and continuous improvement, as well as superior performance, have been key concepts in the well-known total quality movement towards increased productivity and competitiveness. However, although necessary, these will not be sufficient conditions for achieving future success unless we also incorporate into our activities a deep sense of responsibility and ethics based on values clearly communicated to and accepted by associates, clients, and society. Being able to clearly articulate these principles, implementing the appropriate organizational and functional controls needed to put them into practice, will be one of the most solid foundations for our prosperity in the third millennium. This exciting video conference will discuss these and other key considerations that will be increasingly important for developing trust and confidence among individuals, organizations, communities, and nations. The invited speakers will describe the work of various organizations which are actively involved in promoting ethics and character, and will propose the type of mechanisms and multicultural values that our increasingly globalized workplace will need to put into place in order to increase our sense of responsibility in what we do individually and collectively. It is a pleasure to introduce to you today's expert speakers, Dr. Edward L. Hudgins and Megan Barry. Dr. Hudgins is Director of Regulatory Studies at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., where he specializes in policy areas dealing with agriculture, pharmaceuticals, labor, space, trade, transportation, and international regulatory comparisons. Some of his previous responsibilities have included positions with the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress and the Center for International Economic Growth at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Hudgins has traveled in Latin America, Europe, the former Soviet Union, Africa, and Asia, studying, writing, and speaking on the national economic and social systems of countries in these areas. He has participated in many programs dealing with the transition to free market systems in less developed and formerly socialist countries. Dr. Hudgins appeared on numerous television and radio programs. Some of his publications include Freedom to Trade, Refuting the New Protectionism, and The Last Monopoly, Privatizing Postal Service for the Information Age. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland, a master's from American University, and a doctorate from Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Megan Barry is a consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers, LLP, in the corporate social responsibility and corporate reputation practice. She is the former director of corporate social responsibility and business ethics for Nortel Networks Northern Telecom, where she was in charge of devising and implementing a global strategy around business ethics, including ethical decision-making, human rights, and corporate giving. She has been invited to speak at various organizations and conferences, and has given lectures in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, the Distinguished Speakers Series at the Sloan School of Management at MIT, and the University of Florida and Vanderbilt's Joint International Executive MBA program. Ms. Berry is an emeritus board member of the Ethics Officer Association and is a graduate of the Ethics Officer Association's Executive Development Program. She holds a master's degree in business administration from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and a Bachelor of Science degree in education from Baker University. Welcome. Let us begin with an introductory question. Given the massive accumulations of economic and political power in a global system, can individuals and single organizations realistically have any meaningful impact on ethics and social responsibility? Dr. Hudgins?
Yes, ultimately. Political regimes create incentives for individuals and organizations either to deal with each other based on mutual consent and mutual respect, or to deal with each other based on the initiation of force and exploitation. However, private individuals and institutions also can influence the political regimes and especially the emerging global economy in such a way that we will have a system that promotes and creates the ethical infrastructure necessary not only for prosperity, but for a truly civilized and civil global society.
Ms. Berry.
Richard, I think that's an excellent question, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about what an individual and a single organization can do, how an individual and an organization can implement programs and approaches that will help them be ethical.
Thank you for your comments. Let us begin with Module 1, in which Dr. Hudgins will discuss whether relations between businesses will be governed by mutual consent or by use of force, and the implications of these principles on the economic and political regimes which might emerge in the next millennium.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today through this excellent program. Over the past decade, formerly totalitarian countries have struggled not only to establish productive free market economies, but also the ethical infrastructure and institutions on which free markets are dependent and which free markets ultimately promote and reinforce. It has been a difficult struggle. In Russia, for example, many hard-working and honest entrepreneurs must pay bribes and court friends in government because political power, in many cases, still determines which individuals prosper and which ones do not. This example suggests that an understanding of organizational ethics and responsibility requires an understanding of the economic and political institutions and arrangements in which businesses operate. While all individuals ultimately are responsible for how they treat their workers, colleagues, and customers, the incentives and disincentives created by economic and political institutions crucially affect the ethical practices of our organizations. The world is experiencing profound economic changes with the emergence of more integrated global markets and with the informations and communications revolution. How will these changes affect the ethos of enterprises? To answer this question, I shall do three things. First, I will review the economic changes that have occurred in the world in past decades. Second, I will discuss the nature of ethics in a social context. And third, I will consider the new global economic and political order and how it affects and is affected by the ethical standards which enterprises operate. The 19th century saw the emergence of relatively free market systems in Western Europe, North America, and elsewhere, and a relatively free trade regime internationally. During the Industrial Revolution, the value premium was on manufactured products, including steel, industrial goods, infrastructures, and textiles. This system was based on the premise that free markets and free exchange benefited all individuals and countries. But in the early 20th century, political nationalism placed strains on this system. The colonial powers gave trade preferences to their colonies. America erected high tariffs. Countries like Italy and Germany saw self-sufficiency as a political necessity. And of course, the Soviet Union was outside of the world trade system. The premise of this system was that economics is a zero-sum game. It was assumed that if one country or individual prospers, it must be at the expense of others that lose and suffer. After World War II, many countries initially returned to more free market systems. Through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, tariff levels were reduced from a 40% average down to about a 3.5% average today. But the Cold War still divided the world economically. Further, the West supported many corrupt and repressive regimes in Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere in the name of containing communism. Foreign aid kept ruling elites in power, but generally harmed the people of those countries. And starting especially in the 1960s, industrialized Western countries turned to statist or socialist policies. This brings us through the past decade. The first great change has been in the area of trade. Formal trade barriers have continued to fall. World trade has grown from about $100 billion in 1960 to about $6.5 trillion today. Transportation costs have fallen. The cost of shipping oil, for example, has come down from as much as 70% since the 1970s. The production process is now truly global. There are fewer products that are principally made in USA or in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, or elsewhere. We see the globalization of production, especially in the trade relationships between the United States and Mexico. Despite what many critics feared, most American jobs have not fled to Mexico. But what has happened is that more labor-intensive parts of the production process have gone to Mexico. This has created more jobs for Mexicans and freed up American labor for higher-valued jobs, which benefits both economies. The second great economic change in the past decade is the communications and information revolution. Storage and retrieval of vast amounts of information make accounting, inventory, shipping, and stock functions more efficient. Inexpensive yet powerful computers are revolutionizing engineering and scientific research. For example, the Boeing 777 aircraft was designed and initially tested on computers, reducing development time and costs. This revolution points to another important economic fact. The value premium is not as much on manufactured products as in the past. The premium is on brains, not brawn. Engineers, technicians, medical researchers, and the like add more value to products and thus command higher wages. This means that the quality of workers is more important than in the past. Even in manufacturing facilities, workers often must be computer literate to work with sophisticated monitoring and control equipment. Of course, with the communications revolution, competition in information industries also is becoming global. After all, an individual can write computer software in Sao Paulo as easily as in Silicon Valley and send the product anywhere in the world instantaneously. Let us now switch topics and focus on ethics. If we are to ask how this global regime affects the ethical incentives on which enterprises are based, we must define our terms. Most people approach ethics in a social context by asking questions, for example, does an individual or organization cheat or rob others? Or is that individual or organization trustworthy? But to discover the basic principles of ethics that should govern individuals in a social context, it is useful to ask a more basic question. Why do we need an ethical code to begin with? Consider some rather obvious but profound observations. Plants do not need a code of values. They survive automatically through photosynthesis. Lower animals automatically follow their survival instincts. They perceive food and they eat it. Human beings, however, are different in two ways. First, they need to act volitionally, by will, not principally by instinct, to survive. And second, their means for survival is their rational mind or capacity. We must discover how to survive. We must create our means of survival, whether hunting an animal, planting food, building a skyscraper, or a rocket to the moon, or curing a disease. Human beings must choose to exercise the minds as their primary tool of survival. Thus, a code of ethics to begin with can tell human beings which values to pursue and which virtues to cultivate in order to survive. Here, I do not mean particular survival skills such as the ability to hunt or plant food. I mean that we should cultivate virtues such as rationality, that is, placing thinking above immediate emotional impulses. Honesty, the will to see the truth, whatever it is. Integrity, acting consistently with what one knows to be right. Productiveness, acting as efficacious as possible in attaining one's goals. This understanding also makes clear that each individual is responsible for his or her actions. We are responsible for achieving our own survival and other desires. We are responsible for our actions and choices. It is our responsibility to focus our minds and to determine how to achieve our goals. The philosopher Ayn Rand said that, quote, "As man is a being of self-made wealth, so he is a being of self-made soul," unquote. Those sentiments are found in Eastern thinkers as well. Buddha said, "Self is the ruler of self. Who else can be the ruler?" But most individuals would agree that there is more to life than mere survival. That means, for example, taking satisfaction in one's achievements, that is, holding self-esteem as a value and exercising the virtue of pride. That means sharing one's joys with family and friends. Indeed, Aristotle was correct to say that the highest goal for man is happiness, or to live a full, flourishing life. This understanding of ethics means that each individual must be free to pursue his or her survival and well-being and his or her rational self-interest. Since individuals should be equal in liberty, we can identify a basic ethical principle that should govern individuals in their relations with one another. That principle is, no individual should initiate the use of force against another. I repeat, no individual should initiate the use of force against another. That principle means that relations between individuals should be based on mutual consent. That principle also means that economic relations between individuals must be based on free exchange and trade, with each party consenting to any transaction. This means that the prices at which goods and services are sold and the quantities in which they are produced should be based on supply and demand, because supply and demand is simply another way of saying voluntary trade between individuals. This ethical principle implies that the role of government is to protect the life, liberty, and property of the citizens against the initiation of the use of force or fraud by criminals, robbers, and others who would violate those rights. Such a regime maintains limited, objective laws to define what criminal acts are prohibited and to protect contracts between citizens. It also is important to note that in such a regime, most standards are established in private civil institutions rather than by government, and that most of the challenges of life are met in those institutions. Those include families, churches, fraternal organizations. Voluntary codes of conduct and ethics that govern the relations between private businesses in the United States are an important part of business and civil society. For example, the codes of professional responsibility document voluntary codes that are subscribed to by many business, health, and legal professionals. Often, it is the unwritten codes that constitute the ethical infrastructure that supports a free, peaceful society. In Japan, for example, most individuals believe it is dishonorable to sue another and better to resolve conflicts based on mutual consent. Thus, there are far fewer lawyers in Japan than in the United States, and thus lower legal costs. Let us now consider some of the attributes of a free market. First, individuals or enterprises survive and prosper in a market system by producing goods and services for which others are willing to pay. In other words, wealth is created, not taken at the expense of others. This is why in the United States we speak of the virtue of making money, and why businesses should proudly seek to make profits. Microsoft founder Bill Gates is the richest man in the world, with $100 billion in assets, because he created far more than $100 billion in wealth and benefits for millions of consumers. Second, in a free market, each individual has an incentive to act in an entrepreneurial manner, to seek out economic opportunities, not to wait for them passively. We are used to thinking of businessmen as entrepreneurs who profit by offering goods and services to satisfy customers. But the virtue of entrepreneurship must be cultivated by every individual who acts in a market, including every worker. This is especially true in a fast-changing global market. The free market thinker Ludwig von Mises points out that the distinction we make in economic roles, for example, between consumer and producer, are in fact artificial. In a free market, each producer is also a consumer, and each consumer is also a producer. Concerning the worker, Mises says that, quote, if he has acquired a skill needed for the performance of a certain kind of labor, he is an investor. The laborer is an entrepreneur insofar as his wages are determined by the price the market allows for the kind of work he can perform, unquote. A third attribute of enterprises in a free market system is that they always face competition. Competition impels entrepreneurs to always look for ways to produce better goods and services for lower prices, or to introduce new goods and services. A free market system demands that each individual give his or her best effort, that each individual think, look ahead, and improve skills. Because of competition, goods and services that at first were luxury items that the rich could only afford have become items that can be purchased by even the poorest individuals. In a free market system, inefficient producers often must shut their enterprises or perhaps change jobs. In the United States, for example, 8% of businesses and jobs are eliminated each year, but many more than that are created each year. Consider the ethical incentives created by a market system. Entrepreneurs must exercise self-discipline and personal responsibility, since each individual is responsible for his or her own economic fate. Aristotle noted that individuals have a strong incentive to take responsibility for property that they own exclusively. For example, we see important ethical and social as well as economic transformation in Chile, where Social Security retirement has been privatized, where individuals now own their retirement accounts as private property, and where those funds are invested in stocks. Under such a system, the Chilean citizens, including all workers, have a vested interest in acting in a more responsible manner towards the enterprises in which they work and the economy in general. Much of the class conflict in Chile has evaporated as workers read the financial newspapers just like capitalists to see how well their stock funds are performing. In a market system, individual entrepreneurs have a sense of personal efficacy. They experience responsibility, control over their own lives, and appreciate that they are not helpless pawns of impersonal and unknowable forces. A social system based on voluntary relations between individuals can be contrasted with a system in which it is acceptable for one individual or group of individuals to initiate the use of force against others, a system in which might makes right. In such a system, businessmen have an incentive to acquire political power and influence, to use governments to extract special favors or handouts, or to cripple business competitors. Prosperity does not come solely from creating wealth, but by taking from others as well. It is crucial to understand that, especially in many less developed countries, some businesses benefit by employing the force of government to stifle potential competitors. But the fault does not lie in the free market system. It lies in a lack of economic freedom. Classical corruption is an inherent part of poorer status systems. Elected officials or government bureaucrats wield political power for personal gain, usually contrary to the explicit letter of the law, but in accordance with the unwritten law that encourages such corruption. They might expedite a license for one businessman while making others wait, offer an undeserved government contract, or overlook legal indiscretions. In exchange, government officials might receive cash, a special business deal, a paid vacation, or some other gratuity. Contrast this situation with immigration to the United States. What has attracted immigrants? Immigrants seek a better material condition, to farm their own farms, to run their own enterprises, to work hard, to purchase a house, and provide a better life for their families. Immigrants seek personal liberty, to live as they see fit, to be free from power wielded arbitrarily by governments. America attracts immigrants who tend to share 4 attributes. They love life enough to want the best it has to offer. They understand that to achieve the best in life requires action, exertion, effort. They understand the need to use one's mind and wits to meet life's challenges. And they know that achieving the best in life requires risks. Immigrants also share those attributes with individuals struggling in informal sectors. But in a freer system, those attributes make them model citizens rather than wanted criminals. We have now discussed the 2 rules that could govern relations between individuals and society. That is, mutual consent or the use of force. And we have reviewed the ethical implications of each rule for economies. We next need to consider what kind of global economic and political regime might emerge in the next millennium, and what their effects might be on the ethical order. The Western industrialized countries are experiencing a slow-motion version of the collapse that occurred in the communist world. The contradiction